in Dubai, and this is an online site event to COP28 on monitoring green financial flows. My name is Wojciech Furmański, and I work in DG Climate of the European Commission, and I will be moderating this event. Our topic today is fundamental to the success of climate action. You know what they say, if it's not about the money, it is about the money. But our distinguished panelists are going to look beyond sheer figures, and they are going to touch on many other important aspects. Please note that you are going to be able to ask them questions. If you have one, just submit it via Slido. You will find the QR code on the website of our event. I will later read some of these questions to our panelists. With this out of the way, let me introduce our first panelist, Mr. Bertrand Magnier. Bertrand is a co-rapporteur of the platform on sustainable finance, a group of experts advising the European Commission on the topic. Bertrand, if I'm not mistaken, monitoring green financial flows is one of the main tasks of the platform.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Wojtek, and hello, everybody. I don't see the slides yet on my screen. Perhaps you can put up the first slide, please. While you're doing this, so yes, indeed, this is an overview of what we are trying to do in the platform, and that's a new activity for the platform. We are currently putting together an architecture that will allow us indeed to monitor the capital flows that go into sustainable investments. It's a new activity for the platform, but it's a timely activity because now we have a very comprehensive package, policy package, a lot of incentives for the various market players to basically enhance their effort to go towards more sustainable activities, right? So we have a lot of incentives in place, but we don't have yet a tool that will allow us to monitor progress and take stock of progress over time. So this is the mandate of the subgroup I am co-rapporting together with my colleague Carlos Olming from the SEB Bank. It's a group of 23 people, a lot of market observers, supervisors, data vendors, of course, are very much involved in what we're doing. And amongst the contributors to our subgroup, we have Melina London from the JRC, who is going to talk us through what is being done on this matter from the JRC side. I still do not see the slides. If that could be fixed, please. Can anybody see the slide, or it's?
We see the slides in a small window. Can we maybe make the window bigger? And this is a question to our technical support team.
Otherwise, that's okay. I can follow on my screen, and hopefully you will be able to follow me with the slides. Yeah. So let me carry on. So we are indeed, so I hope this is now showing the first slide. Please confirm otherwise. We are putting in place, like I said, a methodological framework. It's relatively new, so we still have a very limited access to actual data. So what we're trying to do is to identify the big building blocks that will allow for this systematic monitoring over time of capital flows. There is going to be a strong focus on the corporate side of things because at least as far as the European Union is concerned and more broadly developed economies are concerned, we expect a lot of this money coming from the private sector. And a ballpark figure here would be 2/3 of the money coming from the private sector and the remaining third coming from public sources. So right now there is a very large imbalance. We have seen a lot of money coming from public institutions, but what the whole policy package is intending to is basically to deliver on the private side. And that's the focus of this effort now. And that's the private sector focus, I think, is one of the main, novelties of the approach taken. Like I said, we want to measure the contribution of the financial sector towards the objective of the European Green Deal as a whole. So we are mostly talking about climate mitigation and adaptation, but we're also looking into other environmental objectives, So the water, pollution, circular economy, and biodiversity. And the other objective beyond the architecture we are trying to put in place and propose is also to document the investment gap needed. So we will measure the current money flows against the investment gap that remains to be filled. We have in our timeline two main milestones, should I say. First, by the end of Q1 2024, next year, we will be able to share publicly our first methodological report, right? So this is where we will have explained in broad terms the big components, and I will come back to this in my next slide. And then we will also try to depict, at least in terms of general landscape, what are the current market trends, relying yet on very aggregated data and information. And importantly, it's only by the end of next year, Q4 2024, around December, that we should have our first comprehensive assessment. We will have then have the time to populate our database and architecture with a lot of data, again, pending availability. Can I go to the next slide, please? I hope that the slides are following me. I still do not see the screen, but that's okay. So this slide might look a little complicated at first, but there are basically two big elements and two big avenues for us to develop. At the center of this slide, you see the real economy, and this is very much at the heart of what we do. We are not necessarily interested in what is happening in the financial sector per se. We want to understand how the money available for entities, for companies, is actually delivering on those environmental objectives. This is why we focus first on the real economy. And we want to understand whether or not the instruments available in the market are sufficient for companies to deliver on their sustainability objectives. We, for now, of course, we do not have yet access to the actual capital expenditures that are actually spent by companies to address those environmental objectives. And that's going to be rolled out progressively following the reporting regulations in the next 3 to 4 years. We can still take an approach which is based on revenues, and that's what we have chosen in collaboration with data vendors. They are able to determine what are the amounts of revenues that can be allocated to a specific activity. So we will describe the real economy based on a long list of activities. We aim for about 1,000 of such activities that describe the diversity of economic activities overall. And then within those activities, we will be able to identify those that are fully taxonomy aligned, right? So they will be the subject of the first wave of reporting as of next year, first from financial institutions and then from large corporations, for instance, those that fall under the scope of the CSRD regulation. And then in addition to those taxonomy aligned activities, there's a whole set of slightly green activities, but which are still fundamental, either to enable those aligned activities or to indicate that a company is in transition. And we will actually look at transition plans, which are actually delivered by each entity to understand the extent and to assess the extent at which this company is in transition. So that says you don't have to have an entirely green business line, but you are still allowed to go incrementally and little by little green then your investment flows, right? By transferring your activities from brown to green eventually. That's the objective of the overall regulation. And then there's a whole set of activities which are considered brown, which do not contribute substantially to the environmental objectives and which are going to be left out from our framework. Then if you look to the right, then we'll have a mapping that will allow us not only to look at this long set of activities, but which will allow us to look at the sectoral outcomes. And that's a very important aspect, because a lot of those policy incentives are usually designed at the sector level. So we want to understand if those sectors that have the low carbon technology, for instance, speaking about climate, they have the technology at hand. Do they then have enough access to green financial instruments to deliver on those objectives? So it's important to understand the timing of such investments, and that can be looked a bit more finely at the sectoral level. And then eventually one can do all sorts of aggregation, and we will aggregate things up according to the different environmental objectives, again, to understand what are the objectives that are served first. And we know there's a lot of money now flowing to the climate mitigation, still very little going to climate adaptation. So that's a policy objective that needs to be further strengthened. But we don't ignore the rest of the environmental objectives. And hopefully the architecture we are trying to propose will allow in the future incrementally again to understand how much progress there is towards those and other additional environmental objectives. So we look at the real economy, we look at the sectoral distribution of the economy, we look at the activity breakdown, and then we confront this with the actual composition of the balance sheet at the entity level, which will then aggregate up to understand the overall balance sheet exposure to those green activities. So we will use then different types of financing products available for companies, use of proceeds, which are labeled as green, then other general purpose financing instruments, which can also finance certain green activities, and then possibly retained earnings, which can also, for some sectors, also generate a lot of green investments. And then, so this is for the real economy side. And then if you look left, there's a whole description of the financial instruments that are available then for those entities that want to go green or greener. And then we will look primarily at the primary sector in the financial sector, primary market, mostly because we want to understand the direct impact of this money affecting the real economy. But in the case of equities and funds, typically we will also look at the dynamics in the secondary market, which will also indicate the appetite of the financial sector to support those green activities, right? So we will span through the full list of financial instruments, equity, loans, bonds, the funds. We for the time being, we will at least leave out other instruments, including securitization and carbon removal, for instance, for which the market is still very nascent, and for which we don't have enough data to basically to put in our framework. Like I said, we will give a special attention to those entities in transition, and we will look carefully at the existing transition frameworks, starting with what is being compiled by the UNHLEG, but also the OECD framework, the CDP framework, TPT, and so on. And that will allow us to define those criteria that will then determine the extent, again, of transition for a given entity. And in addition to this, we will also look at the transition finance now applying to financial institutions, and we will try to understand, according some criteria or indicators that are under development, how far banks, asset owners, asset managers are themselves under transition. So that is, in a nutshell, the different big building blocks that we are trying to put together. And then if I can go to the next slide to finish with my short introduction here. Then in the last slide, you see what could be an example, at least, of the depiction of this overall sustainable investment landscape. So this is directly extracted from the Climate Policy Initiative framework. They just released their update of the global climate finance landscape. I put it here just for people to understand that eventually, once we have the money identified for each of those instruments, and once we have characterized where the money goes, addressing which activity, which sector, supporting capex in relation to a given objective, environmental objective. Then we are able to put together such a so-called Sankey diagram, where you don't only see the connections between the different items, but the flows and the volume of money linking up the different instruments, market players, objectives, and so on. Will actually the width of such arrows and connectors then will indicate the volume of money, the relative volume of money that goes into each of those items. So in the end, eventually, once we have our system in place, we will progressively feed the data into our framework, pending, of course, the progressive implementation of the reporting obligations from different entities. But eventually, this is what we want to come up with. What is the overall volume of money going to sustainable objectives, again, through the lens of private investments? And where possibly could be the more deficient or lack of policy incentives addressing a particular either market player or environmental objective. So in the end, we want to develop a tool which will be a policy tool, which will not only allow us to track progress, but which could also allow to improve, if need be, then the policy framework to accelerate the transition to those 6 environmental objectives. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Bertrand, thank you for explaining so well the work of the platform in this area, and we are obviously looking forward to the resulting report next year. A little message to our speakers. Apparently, to see the slides, you need to pin Lionel's window. So look for 3 dots, select them, and pin it in Zoom. Okay. Next up, we have Mr. Giuseppe Sciascia from DG Reform. This is a Commission department for helping member states to reform. Giuseppe works in a unit in charge of reforms of the financial sector. Giuseppe, I guess you are going to tell us how member states can benefit from the support your unit provides.
Indeed, Wojciech, thank you very much, and good morning to all the colleagues. I'm very pleased, first of all, to represent the Commission DG Reform to this COP28 site event. And today, in my short presentation, I will try to give indeed an overview of the work that we Commission, in particular our DG, carries out to support member states in enhancing their capacity to monitor green capital flows. In order to do so, I will try first of all to present what DG Reform does and what the instrument that we run is about. And then I will provide an overview of the context, objectives, and beneficiaries of our support projects in the area of sustainable finance. And then I will give some concrete examples of technical support projects we have done, in particular those dealing with the monitoring of green financial flows, the promotion of sustainable finance, and this is a topic that I'm very attached to, the fight to greenwashing. Next slide, please. So first of all, I'd like to start by introducing the structure and goals of our support work. To say that DG Reform is the Commission service that is responsible for managing the technical support instrument, so the TSI. The TSI is a facility that has been established under the multi-annual financial framework of the European Union with the objective of helping member states to prepare and implement structural reforms. And so with the TSI, the Commission does something very simple. We provide technical expertise to member states, cooperating with a number of actors, public and private actors. And all member states can actually require our support every year, and we have at our disposal around 110 million euros every year until 2027. Our projects cover different policy areas. We have in our radar governance, public administration, labor market, business environment, sustainable growth, and labor market. But also we work in the financial sector and access to finance area, the policy area that is covered actually by the unit I represent, which encompasses sustainable finance. And so in this area, we cooperate with a number of stakeholders that are relevant for the financial sector. So typically, we work with ministries of finance and economy, central banks, financial supervisory authorities, and national development banks. Our projects start from a need, a request submitted by a member state, which then is assessed in light of its urgency, the relevance of the problem, and the its aims. And then our support can be concretely brought on the ground, combining, as I said before, the assistance of various providers and also Commission's own expertise. So, for example, we work directly on some projects also together with the JRC, and our projects last from 1 year to 2-3 years, depending on their complexity, the reach, and whether there are more than one member state involved. Next slide, please. Now, as you can imagine, sustainable finance has gained significant attention under the perspective of structural reform support due to a number of interrelated factors that I cannot but stress. So the fact that there is an increasing pressure on the economy and the financial sector caused by climate change and environmental degradation. There are pressing challenges for the societies at large, and also the need, and this is a topic of this panel, for an increasing flow of money from the public and private sector. In particular, under the perspective of public finance, member states face the challenge, first of all, of integrating ESG considerations in their budgetary and fiscal framework to cover financing gaps, to ameliorate fiscal forecasts, and increase preparedness due to the impact of the various phenomena associated with climate and environmental degradation. When it comes to private capital, I think there are 3 main challenges that we are observing and on which we are helping member states. One is that member states shall mobilize private resources available in the financial system towards sustainable activities, creating what we can call like an ecosystem for sustainable finance to grow. And I will explain later what we have done in this respect. Secondly, they shall work in implementing the sustainable finance regulatory framework and the ambitious agenda that the EU in particular has put forward in this regard. And last but not least, and this is in particular the job of the supervisory authorities, the member states shall monitor the integration of ESG considerations in the risk management practices of financial markets participants. Now, in order to cope with these challenges, so those for the public sector and those for the private sector, of course, looking at the perspective of structural reform support for member states, we work with various counterparts. We work with ministries of finance, we work with independent fiscal institutions, ministries of environment, national development and promotional institutions, and financial supervisory authorities to help them, as I said before, dealing with these challenges. Next slide, please. I will now try to explain concretely what this means in terms of projects, to give you a couple of examples. The first one, and in particular to touch both on the public and private dimension. The first example that I want to provide refers to what I said before, the ecosystem, let's say, for sustainable finance to grow. And indeed, a first group of initiatives, of important initiatives that we have worked on in these last years is represented by initiatives aimed at supporting the development of green capital markets and instruments. For example, we have worked with the European Ministries of Finance to develop sustainable finance action plans that are specific and tailored to the needs of the concerned member states. So by starting from an analysis of the needs in terms of investments that the specific economy of a given member state faces, we have supported member states to design and issue sovereign green bonds. And we have also worked to develop pipelines of sustainable infrastructure projects to be financed via public and private partnerships. Next slide, please. A second important work stream is represented by the one that we have launched with national development and promotional banks and institutions, which, as you know, are very peculiar institutions sitting in between the public and the public and the private sector. And so we believe they are very relevant and important for us to deliver in this area. We have worked with them, for example, and you see a couple of examples in slides, to analyze the specific local economies' green and climate-related investment needs, so as to build appropriate financing strategies that then, again, are tailored to the needs of specific member states or regions in some cases, or areas covered by several member states. And we have also worked to support these institutions in embedding sustainability in their investment policies, again, with a positive effect on the way they actually make money flow, and to meet sustainability requirements, for example, as established under the InvestEU framework. So again, to align them with EU-wide priorities. Next slide, please. Now, last but not least, there is this area that is increasingly important, which, if you allow me, represents the other side of the coin of growing flow of financial flows towards green activities, and which is represented by tackling greenwashing. So basically, avoiding the risk that money that is represented as flowing towards green activities in reality does not. This is a topic that we are starting to address by working together with national competent authorities, so the financial supervisory authorities in Europe, because this is a topic that has been addressed by the ESAs recently, also in light of a mandate provided by the European Commission, and that will then land into a report due by the first quarter of 2024. In particular, we have started to work very recently with some NCAs, in particular 8 NCAs in 8 member states, to develop methodologies and analytical tools to spot greenwashing practices in the financial sector. So what we are doing, basically, we are starting to work with these authorities to collect the data and to build the methodologies that are needed in order to understand when investment products, both as investment funds or investment-based insurance products that are disclosed as pursuing sustainable objectives, do not in reality do so. And in particular, we will start by working on assessing the language used in financial products names, documentation, advertising, periodic publications, again, to understand whether the image that the product provides is consistent with its real profile. And this is for us a way to contribute basically to the objective of avoiding, as I said before, that certain activities that actually should be counted in sustainable finance in reality are not contributing, or are not contributing at all, or are not contributing as they claim to the achievement of sustainable finance objectives. So I think this is an interesting initiative to really look at the other side, let's say, of the negative, if you allow me, capital flows. So next slide, just to thank you very much for your attention, and I pass back the floor to Wojciech and the other speakers. Thank you.
Giuseppe, thank you. It's good to know that national authorities are not alone and there is technical support that they can tap into. Okay, next up, we have Ms. Melina London from the Joint Research Center of the EC. Melina is a scientific officer in the Economic and Financial Resilience Unit of the GRC. Melina, I guess you are going to approach today's topic from a scientific point of view.
Hi, Wojciech. Good morning, everyone. So yes, today what I will try to do is to build on my experience as a scientist at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission on sustainable finance, to guide you through how science can help policymakers monitor green financial flows. So first thing is, what is exactly the Joint Research Center? So the Joint Research Center of the European Commission is a Directorate General in charge of providing the scientific evidence to guide policymaking. And in my team working in sustainable finance, which we started working on green financing and green financial flows. And based on this experience, I think science can bring to this question of monitoring green financial flows in 3 ways. First, scientists can help conduct comprehensive stock takes. They can also participate to the construction of scientifically sound indicators and then help to carry out scientific impact assessments. So going to the next slide, we'll start by the conduction of comprehensive stock takes. So as scientists and as economists, when we first started to study green financial flows, our first goal was to understand the market. So we went to the data and we went into the analysis of, okay, what is the situation out there? So the first step is identifying relevant market instruments. So as some of you might know, one of the main market instruments for green financing are green bonds, which means they are debt instruments used by firms to finance green projects only. So the issuer of the bond commits to finance only these green projects. And what we did was trying to see how this green bond market had evolved around the last few years. So here on the graph, you can see the total issuance in the EU and outside the EU across years, as well as the share of those green bonds in overall bond financing, which are the two lines, the gray in the EU, the gray outside the EU, and the green in the EU. And what we saw, for instance, is that the share of green bonds is decreasing much quicker in the EU rather than outside the EU. So that would be the first part, like identifying the main dynamics on the markets. But then another part is really what are the data that are not there? What are the data gaps? So on this question of green financing, one important black point is green loans, because loans are another main financing tools for firms. And the thing is, they're not publicly traded as bonds. So, and they're highly confidential data. So for now, in terms of loans, in green loans, we only have data on very big loans that we call syndicated loans. And we do not have an accurate image of what is happening on the overall green markets. This is currently changing because the European Banking Authority has started to launch a survey to collect some data. But understanding what are the data gaps is very important for us to be able to say, what can we not say, and where should be the next improvements. Another important part of our work as scientists to build this comprehensive stock take is to assess data quality. So for this, I will build on I'll take the example of a study done by one of my colleagues, Yorgos Papadopoulos, on the main type of climate mitigations data, which are greenhouse gas emissions. And what Yorgos did in his paper was to compare the emissions reported by different data providers. So you can see on the graph on the right, there are three types of emissions. You have the first scope 1, which are all the direct emissions like produced by the firm through the asset it owns. Those here, it's quite standardized. It's easily reported and estimated. So you can see there are not a lot of discrepancies across data providers. But then you have scope 2 and scope 3 emissions. Scope 2 is all emissions that are indirectly produced by the firm through the energy production it consumes. And scope 3 are all the emissions indirectly produced through the value chains. And here you have, like, as it's indirect emission, it's much more complex. It's more complex to report for firms, and it's more complex to estimate for data providers also when the firms do not directly report. So what we see is that we have very large discrepancies. The size of the ratio from one data provider to the other are much more important. So what we see is that when we have some data, and emissions data, they are the most widely developed source of data, I would say. But we, as scientists, we have to question those data. We have to ask whether we can rely on this data, what is the scope, how can we use them? How can we use them in the narrative? Because going to the next slide, we use those data to build indicators, to then build our narrative, to talk to policymakers, for instance. And what we see is that when we try to build indicators, we have to match both the policy objectives and the constraint on the indicator, which are mainly data-driven. And so it means that, for instance, when we try to build indicators on green financing, we first have to define greenness. But based on the data available, we quickly saw in our case that one size does not fit all. You cannot have the same definition used for all types of assets you will analyze. So for some types of assets, you'll be able to define greenness at the security level using standard or labels. For other, you will need to go at the company level using, for instance, EU taxonomy alignment. Or if the firm is not currently reporting on this, you might want to switch to emission-based criterion, for instance. This is to say, like, there's no clear way to build an indicator to define, what you're studying. So it means you may need to make hypotheses. You need to make choices. And what is very important as scientists is that you state clearly those hypotheses so that then they can be questioned by others. Then what your whole methodology can be reviewed by your peer, discuss, and then you can reach consensus on how to monitor this specific type of green flow, for instance. Then going to the next slide, the last important point in my view is how science can help conduct impact assessments. Because our ultimate objective, as detailed by other speakers earlier, is the transition of our economies to net zero emissions. We want to make sure that we are going to a net zero pathways. And we want to make sure that the green financing is actually supporting this transition, that it's not greenwashing, as Giuseppe was mentioning earlier. And for this, we need to conduct some impact assessment continuously through times. For one example could be the impact of green bonds on issuers' emissions. So that's a study conducted by two of my colleagues, trying to understand whether when a firm had issued a green bond, whether it led to a decrease of its emissions. And what they see is that they see significant impacts, and they see a decrease in emission that is even more pronounced when the green bond has had been issued after the Paris Agreement, where everyone had come to a common definition of what is the target of our transition, the 1.5 degree. And the decrease is also more pronounced when you have the green bond that is validated by a third party. So that is a first step. But then in the future, what we would like to do is to work on green financing and adaptation of or other environmental objectives, such as biodiversity, circular economy, etc. We also want to understand on the question of transition, whether firms that are transitioning, so going from brown to green, whether they have a specific financing structure. Then we can decide whether they need specific extra financing tool, for instance. Or we might also want to see whether green financing can help firms build resilience to non-climate crises that are still likely to happen, even in the context of the big climate crisis. So for all of those questions to be answered, what we need is data quality and availability. So we need data on climate adaptation. We need data on biodiversity and other environmental objectives, because without data, we cannot conduct a comprehensive analysis. And we will need those data to be available to the research community as a whole, being us as researchers in the public sector, but also researchers in the private sectors and in academia. And going to the main slide to conclude, what I really want to highlight is the need for collaboration. which is what we try to do as GRC through the Sustainable Finance Research Forum, where we try to offer a platform for discussion between all the different actors. So I invite you to follow our page and look at the events we have and the research we conduct. Many thanks to all of you, and Wojciech, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Melina, for offering us this science-based perspective, and also thank you for pointing us to additional resources. This is very useful. Okay, and finally, we have Ms. Ana Maria Di Crescencio from the OECD, a senior economist and manager at the International Finance and Accession Unit. Ana Maria, I guess you will offer us a broader perspective, and you will talk about green flows from developed countries to emerging economies. Is that right?
Yes, indeed. Thank you for the introduction. Let me say that our work has focused so far on flows going to emerging market economies. The reason for this is that we received a request by the G20 presidency this year, trying to track the flows, private capital financing the climate transition in emerging markets. And what we heard is that emerging markets, they do have a small domestic investor base, and they have limited fiscal capacity, and they are now confronted with the challenge of meeting net zero in a short time frame. And the G20 countries wanted to understand the magnitude of these flows and also to which country these flows are going from developed economies. So we try to explore this, and our focus has been we had to be very practical because we had to do an analysis in a short time frame with the available data, and we focused on investment funds. So the background for this choice is that asset under management of investment funds worldwide has grown substantially over the last 10 years. And they are an important source of financing for emerging market economies. So in this broad category that we call non-bank financial intermediaries, NBFIs, you have investment funds, and they represent more than 40% of financial intermediation and 50% of external financing in emerging markets. So this sector is an important source of capital, and this may be further leverage for green finance. And for these reasons, we have focused our analysis on these players. So this was the background, but there was also a practical reason, the practical reason being that we could easily find data on these players. While, as explained in other presentations, other sources of financing, it's complicated to find data on other segments. So this was also practical because it was rather easy to find the data. So capital markets, what you see here in this chart, have shown a strong and growing appetite for sustainable investing, and the asset under management by sustainable funds have more than tripled over the decade 2010-2020, and we've seen an exponential boom in the last 3 years that you see in the spike in the chart. They've peaked at around $3.2 trillion at the end of 2021, and they have accounted for around 6.2 of the global asset under management, according to our estimates. You see that there is a recent downward adjustment in 2022. However, sustainable investment is expected to continue to grow in the next few years. And what we see, the yellow shaded area, is that while on aggregate 11% of all fund investment go to emerging markets, sustainable investment funds send only about 6% of their investment to EMEs. In other words, the sustainable investment has been so far more an advanced economies phenomenon, and it has touched emerging markets only marginally. So we think that there is a gap that emerging markets can try to leverage the sustainable investment phenomenon and try to attract more sustainable investment in these countries. We can move to the next slide, please. Yes. So past OECD research has shown that the majority of so-called sustainable and ESG investment is unrelated to climate impact. And so the issue of greenwashing that has been also mentioned by previous speakers has been discussed in a number of fora, and the OECD has contributed to this in a number of papers. So when we had to conduct this exercise, we had access to a data set with 37,000 mutual funds, investment funds at a global level, but we had to identify which are the funds that are investing a substantial share of their portfolio towards green sectors. So we had to come up with a definition, and we decided to move, you see in the diagram on the left-hand side, from a broader definition of funds to a classification that allows us to identify those funds that invest into renewable energy, green transport, buildings, and energy efficiency. And we define this subsector as green funds in our analysis. And we chose a threshold. So we decided that we would have called the green funds the funds that allocate at least 25% of their portfolio into companies involved in carbon solutions, which are those that I defined just earlier, involved in renewable energy, green transport, building, energy efficiency. So you see that in the diagram on the left-hand side, we see the number of funds that goes from the broader to different definitions. The second circle is the sustainable funds. We think that these are still not too close to actual climate impact. So that's why we suggest to get closer to the climate impact and focus on these green funds. And in the report that we presented to the G20, we highlighted the importance of using a very precise and robust definition of green funds. Then you can see on the chart on the right-hand side that we conducted an analysis at the securities level, meaning that we went fund by fund, security by security, and we managed to track the investments of these green funds into different countries. So the chart shows that green funds primarily invest into the United States, and the second economy that received these flows is China. China represents the lion's shares of green investment into emerging markets. You see that then the next bar is represent emerging markets, that is basically almost overlapping with China. So China is really the biggest country for emerging market economies. And then it may be a little bit small to see in this graph, but Brazil is the second emerging market. It comes at a very far distance from China. So you may ask, why so much green investment flowing towards China? Is it because of the size of the market? We think that China offers profitable green projects, and it has a competitive green manufacturing supply chains. It's a key player in a number of renewable energy supply chains, for example, the solar photovoltaic cells, electric vehicle batteries. These value chains are particularly important. And when we conduct the analysis at the security level, so we're able to see exactly the money is arriving in which companies. We are able to see that companies that are appearing in the sample are involved in battery manufacturing, electric cars, photovoltaic technology, and smart homes. So the analysis highlights that for emerging markets, to being able to attract capital flows in their countries, they need to have a profitable and successful manufacturing industry in the renewable energy. So to conclude, we say that achieving net zero requires strong mobilization of private capital flows towards emerging markets. Investment funds are more and more important to bring external financing to these countries, and there is a potential for emerging markets to attract green investment at a time when sustainable investment is increasing. However, when we look at the investment allocation, it's important to get as close as possible to the actual climate impact. In other words, we need to attract investment that actually reach the green sectors. And yes, if we move to the next slide, the OECD is involved in a number of work streams in relation to green finance. The report that you can see on the left-hand side is the one that I just commented on, is a report that we presented to the G20 on measuring green capital flows. The report moving towards the closer to the right is the one that I mentioned on ESG ratings, the one that comments on the fact that the E pillar could be further improved. And then there are two other reports, one on climate alignment of finance and the one on global biodiversity finance that have been compiled by colleagues in the Environment Directorate that also cover issues that have been discussed today. So to conclude, the OECD offers a wide range of research and policy analysis that can help policymakers working on these issues. Thank you for inviting us today.
Anna Maria, thank you for this global perspective, and thank you for the links to additional resources. This is really appreciated. All right. I think that we can now move to the Q&A part. I will now click on the link that I received from our Slido moderator to get the questions from the audience. I hope nothing bad happens. Okay. I see the questions. Not sure you are seeing them. So I will read them out to you. Let's start with Bertrand. In your presentation, you focused on the methodology that the platform on sustainable finance is going to develop, but maybe you could now complement that with some examples of instruments that can facilitate green investment. Also, a different question, maybe you could, but to you could elaborate on financial flows in the global context, so what we called climate finance. Bertrand. Unmute your mic.
Sorry then. Now you hear me. Sorry. Like I said, a lot of those important instruments have been already explained by my predecessors, but chief of them still remain the green bonds issuance. I think this is what attracts most money right now, and I would like to emphasize the fact that the European Union is responsible for more than 40% of global green bond issuance. So this is really the instrument of choice right now to deliver on those sustainable objectives. Now, if you look at the most recent trends, there are still, and you know, the green bonds, the overall cumulative figure, if you want to have an idea of what that represents, we're talking about 1.2 trillion euros overall. So that still is a very large figure. This is to say that there is still now a lot of money going into sustainable investments. But there are other instruments. So Anna Maria just talked us through the funds, for instance. So they can play a very big role because the overall amount of asset under management in those funds is huge, right? But still, too little money goes through the funds, and now we have seen even the downgrading of some of those funds which do have sustainability as an objective, the so-called Article 9 funds. So they have been downgraded to slightly to other types of funds, Article 8, sometimes Article 6, with much lower levels of ambitions to address specific and sustainability objectives. So that's something we should monitor closely. There is a certain lack of appetite in recent months just because funds do not or find it difficult sometimes to justify the money direction. And maybe this is not this can point to some, for some at least, the tendency to go for some greenwashing activities more than investments that do deliver on sustainable activities. So that's one of the things we need to monitor. The green bonds, that's functioning quite well. Other instruments, not so well. The sustainability linked loans and bonds are also on the decline at the moment. In recent months, we've seen that too. Something to monitor. And to the second question, in a nutshell, I want to end with a positive note. We saw from the CPI document that in the last 2 years, climate finance has no less than doubled. And a lot of it is actually pulled by first the European Union and the US, but also more recently by China. It was also just mentioned by Anna Maria, because China is doing a lot and is attracting now a lot of money. They are the leaders in green manufacturing, which is the engine of this transition that we are calling for. And I think it's really suggesting that there is still now a lot of appetite for everything green, and there's no way back. So I would like to leave it there, just to explain that everybody is on board, does have access to those financial instruments, including in Africa. You have a lot of digitalization of the financial sector, which allows for those African commercial banks, for instance, to issue green bonds on their own now. So they do own those instruments that prove useful in the context of developed economies, and that can then be transposed relatively easily in other types of jurisdictions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Bertrand. Melina, you approached the topic as a scientist, but we often hear that there is a gap between researchers and policymakers. So the question a speaker asked is, what can we do to bridge this gap? And in other words, why it is important to always include science?
Well, I think, yes, indeed, we have a problem because scientists speak their own language with their own method and method, like their own method, their own perspective, while policymakers have other priorities on the same question, speaking another language. And what happens is that usually the two does not meet. So what we need is really to open the discussions, create space to really involve them in one common discussion. So an example of this is what we try to do as JRC for to have like the Sustainable Finance Research Forum, to offer space for discussion between the two, and because I think science is important to bring into the debate, because you need to have this neutrality of science. You need to have the peer review process. You need to go back to the fact and question those facts. So I don't want to be too long, but this is an idea of an answer.
Okay, thank you so very much. Here's one to Anna Maria from the OECD. How can investors from developed countries assess their impact in emerging economies? What challenges do they face?
Yes, there are a number of challenges related to investment in emerging economies. I mentioned earlier the issues that we have in relation to ESG ratings and labels. There are inappropriate interpretations regarding the interpretation of the E pillar, for example, in the ESG ratings. Emerging markets also struggles in getting some of these ratings. There are also issues related to emerging markets risk and return profiles. the emerging markets are perceived as riskier investment destinations. And then there's other issues related to the current functioning of the global capital markets. For example, some of these investment funds that I described earlier rely on indices. They use passive investment strategies, so they follow indices, or they favor large companies, so they would invest in companies with a certain type of characteristics, and sometimes the emerging markets do not have many of these champions. So we think that it's not that tackling only one factor is gonna magically solve the issue, but we need an approach that covers a number of issues and is also tailored to each particular emerging market, because we have seen that countries like China or Brazil have different green sectors, different financial sectors, different levels of capital account liberalization. So the approach has to be really targeted to each country, and companies have to increase also transparency. So trying to show in a transparent way how the investments are then linked to the green impact that we have been mentioning earlier in the presentation. So it's not unfortunately one silver bullet only, but a comprehensive approach that can help countries attracting investment in a sustainable way.
Thank you, Anna Maria. And finally, a question to Giuseppe from DG Reform. I guess it comes from a potential beneficiary because they would like to know how DG Reform can help them concretely, and they would like to get an example of a finished and a very successful project. Giuseppe, over to you for that.
Thank you, Wojciech. I see we are a little bit late. I try to be as brief as possible. So on the first question, how we can help them? Well, I think there are many things we can do in this area. As I said at the beginning and in my presentation, it depends on their needs. What we see, the most pressing issues are three, I would say. One, enhancing the capacity of member states to collect data. This is very important. I think it resonates with what colleagues were saying before. Secondly, building sound and robust methodologies. It is quite relevant to make sure that, for example, sustainable finance capital market strategies are successful, but also monitoring capacities are well established. And last but not least, increasing administrative capacity often means investing in human resources, so building skills inside the administration. This is really important because expertise in this area lags behind, and as was said by Melina, this is an area that is really driven by research, and so it's very important to establish a sound knowledge of the topics at stake and the risks at stake, and so on. An example of successful project, well, there is one that I really liked, and it covers a bit what we said during this panel, which was a project we carried out with one member state, helping it to develop its sovereign green bond framework, enabling actually the member state to issue for the first time ever its first sovereign green bond. But also it was a project where we have helped them to basically identify and establish a policy framework to channel private and public capital to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. And what is really interesting in this project is that during the activities, we have performed a mapping of the public and private investment flows towards different strategic building blocks, like enhancing energy efficiency, deployment of renewables, mobility, circular economy, and so on, to identify actually the investment gaps to achieve carbon neutrality. So basically, we had to really collect the data, analyze the data on the public and private flows. And so it has been really interesting because we gave sound and evidence-based indications to the authorities on how then to build a strategy towards climate neutrality. So I think it's a successful example of something we have very concrete that we have made. Thanks for the questions.
Thank you, Giuseppe. All right, that was the last question we had time for, I'm afraid. I think it is fair to say that we have covered a lot of ground today. Topics ranging from science to administrative capacity and from the EU to the global perspective. A big thank you to our speakers and our listeners. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you and see you soon, hopefully in about half an hour. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank
Thanks
you.
very much.